December 1943. A German pilot opens an envelope in his cockpit. Inside, orders to annihilate 4,000 people in minutes. His finger hovers over the bomb release. One choice, one refusal, and history splits in two. What happened next was buried in classified files for 50 years. A secret so dangerous that speaking it meant death. A single act of defiance that saved thousands of lives and ignited a hidden war within the Reich itself. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The night a man chose his soul over his uniform and changed the course of the war from the inside. If you want to uncover the forbidden truths of World War II that history tried to erase, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and comment which city you're watching from. Because Shadow of War brings you the stories too dangerous to forget. The winter sky over occupied Poland was the color of iron and ash, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the earth as if the heavens themselves had grown sick of watching what men did below. It was December 1943, and Flight Lieutenant Hans Reichmann sat alone in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 110, staring at the sealed envelope that had been thrust into his hands just moments before by a stone-faced SS courier who had refused to meet his eyes. The engine of his aircraft thrummed with quiet menace, a mechanical heartbeat waiting to carry him toward something he could not yet name but already feared with a dread that tasted like copper in his mouth. Around him, the scattered hangars of the airfield at Lodz stood like crooked teeth against the dying light, and somewhere in the frozen forests beyond, thousands of people whose names he would never know were living the final hours of their ordinary, precious lives. Hans Reichmann held that envelope in his gloved hands and felt the weight of the entire war pressing against his chest. Though he did not yet know that what he was about read would force him to choose between his soul and his uniform, between the obedience drilled into him since he was 17 and the quiet voice of his conscience that had grown louder with every bombing run, every village reduced to rubble, every plume of black smoke rising from places where children once played. The seal on the envelope bore the Reich eagle, and as he slid his thumb beneath it, he understood with sudden, terrible clarity that some orders, once opened, cannot be unopened, and some choices, once made, reshape the very fabric of history in ways that echo through generations yet unborn. Inside the envelope, the words were typed in cold, efficient German, each character pressed into the paper with the mechanical precision of a regime that had industrialized murder itself. The order was direct, appallingly simple in its language. At 0400 hours the following morning, he was to lead a squadron of 4 aircraft in a coordinated strike against a series of rail lines and switching stations 17 kilometers northeast of his position, disrupting what intelligence had designated as a critical transportation corridor. But there was a second page, classified at the highest level, and it was this page that made Hans's blood run cold as he read it beneath the dim cockpit light. The rail lines, the order explained, were currently being used to transport approximately 4,000 prisoners of war and political detainees toward the Swiss border, part of an unauthorized evacuation being conducted by a rogue SS commander who had apparently grown a conscience too late in the war and was attempting to save those under his watch by moving them west, away from the advancing Soviet front, toward potential liberation. The order was explicit. The trains were to be destroyed completely, all cargo eliminated, no survivors, no witnesses, and the operation was to be disguised as a partisan railway sabotage to prevent any possibility of these prisoners reaching Allied lines where their testimonies might prove inconvenient to certain highly placed officials, whose names were not mentioned but whose presence Hans could feel hovering over every typed word like vultures over a battlefield. He read the order 3 times, each reading making his hands shake more violently than the last, and when he finally looked up from the paper, the winter sky seemed to have grown even darker, as if night itself was rushing forward to swallow what remained of the day. Hans Reichmann had not always been a man divided against himself, though he could barely remember now what it felt like to believe in anything with the clean, uncomplicated certainty of youth. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, a boy of 19 with stars in his eyes and speeches about glory rattling in his skull, believing with the fervent faith of the young and stupid that he was part of something larger than himself, something heroic and pure. He had been good at flying, better than good. His instructors had said with approval that warmed him then but now felt like a curse, and he had risen quickly through the ranks, earning his Iron Cross after a dogfight over the Channel where he had shot down 2 British Spitfires and felt, for one terrible, exhilarating moment, like a god of the ancient myths his mother had read to him as a child. But that was 3 years and a lifetime ago, before he had seen the things he had seen, before the missions had changed from military targets to things he could not allow himself to name even in the privacy of his own skull. He had flown over burning villages where the fires seemed to scream. He had dropped ordnance on coordinates that turned out to be hospitals, schools, places where the innocent huddled in their final moments. And each time he had told himself the lies that soldiers tell themselves to survive. That it was necessary, that it was war, that someone else would do it if he refused, that his hands were clean because he only flew the plane and pressed the button and never looked back at what bloomed in his wake. But this order, this unmarked envelope with its clinical language about relocation facilities and final processing, stripped away every comfortable lie he had wrapped around himself like a threadbare blanket against the cold, and forced him to see with sudden, horrifying clarity exactly what kind of war he had been fighting. Hans Reichmann had not always been a man who questioned orders. He had been raised in the small Bavarian town of Landshut, where his father had been a postal clerk and his mother had sung in the church choir every Sunday, her voice rising like smoke toward the vaulted ceiling of St. Martin's as if prayer alone could hold back the gathering storms of the world. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1937, young and eager, his head filled with notions of honor and service, of defending the fatherland from those who would see it humbled and broken as it had been after the Great War. He had been a good pilot, perhaps even an exceptional one, his reflexes sharp and his nerves steady even when the sky erupted in tracer fire and flak explosions that turned the air itself into shrapnel. He had flown over France and watched the Stuka dive bombers scream down like birds of prey. He had escorted bombers over the English Channel and seen the white cliffs of Dover disappear beneath curtains of smoke. He had done his duty always without question, because that was what a soldier did, what a man did, what the fatherland demanded of those who wore its uniform. But something had changed in Hans Reichmann over the past year, a slow poisoning of certainty that had begun the day he flew reconnaissance over a village in Ukraine and saw below him not military installations or strategic targets but simply houses, small houses with gardens, and he had watched those houses vanish beneath the bombs dropped by the squadron ahead of him, erased in blossoms of fire and collapsing stone, and for just a moment before the smoke obscured everything, he had seen a child's red bicycle lying in a yard, perfectly still, waiting for a rider who would never return. He had told himself then, as he told himself after every mission, that war was war, that orders were orders, that soldiers did not have the luxury of philosophy when the fate of the fatherland hung in the balance. But the red bicycle had stayed with him, appearing in his dreams with the persistence of a ghost, and now, holding this new order in his hands, he felt that same sick weight in his stomach, that same sense of standing at the edge of an abyss so deep that no light could escape from its depths. The order specified that the buildings were to be destroyed completely, that no warning was to be given, that the operation was classified at the highest level and any discussion of it would result in immediate court-martial and execution. Hans read the words again, then a third time, as if repetition might somehow change their meaning, might transform the monstrous into the merely difficult. But the letters remained fixed on the page like insects preserved in amber. For 1,000 people. The number sat in his mind like a stone. For 1,000 individuals, each with a name, a face, a history of small joys and private griefs. For 1,000 hearts beating in the cold Polish winter, unaware that a man they would never meet was sitting in a cockpit reading the order for their annihilation. He had flown 47 combat missions, had dropped bombs on military installations and railway yards and supply depots, had told himself with each sortie that this was war, that these were the necessities of survival, that duty demanded the surrender of doubt. But this was different, and even as his mind tried to wrap itself around the language of the order, his hands had begun to tremble in a way they never had during combat, not even when flak had torn through his wing over Stalingrad. Not even when he had watched his wingman spiral into the earth in a plume of black smoke and flame. Hans Reichmann had been born in Munich in 1919, the son of a mathematics professor and a piano teacher, raised in a home where Beethoven played on Sunday mornings and his mother served apple strudel that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and safety. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, young and idealistic, believing the speeches about honor and fatherland, about restoring Germany to greatness after the humiliations of Versailles. He had been good at flying, better than good, his natural grace in the cockpit earning him rapid promotions and the quiet respect of men who did not give respect easily. But somewhere between the invasion of Poland and the burning of Rotterdam, between the screaming descent over London and the frozen horror of the Russian front. Something inside him had begun to crack, a fissure that widened with every mission until he could no longer tell himself the comfortable lies that let other men sleep at night. He had seen things that no amount of propaganda could justify, villages obliterated for no strategic reason, columns of refugees strafed on open roads, the smoldering remains of places that had never housed a single soldier. And now, as he read this order again in the dimming light of his cockpit, he understood that he had finally reached the edge of a moral precipice from which there would be no return, because the buildings he was meant to destroy were not military targets at all, but death camps operating under the thinnest veneer of bureaucratic euphemism, and the 4,000 souls inside them were not enemy combatants but prisoners, civilians, families whose only crime had been to be born into the wrong. Categories in a world gone mad with hate. His hands trembled as he folded the order and placed it on his lap, and for several long minutes he simply sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the wind howl across the airfield and feeling the terrible weight of the decision forming in his chest like a stone. To obey the order would be to become something he could never come back from, a murderer on an industrial scale, a man who had crossed the final threshold beyond which no redemption was possible. But to refuse would mean court-martial, execution, disgrace for his family, and the near certainty that another pilot would simply be assigned in his place, that the mission would proceed regardless of his conscience, that his sacrifice would be meaningless in the vast machinery of the Reich's genocidal ambitions. Yet even as these rational calculations played out in his mind, he knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he could not fly this mission, could not press the button that would release the bombs, could not live with himself if he allowed this order to transform him into an instrument of mass murder. The question was not whether he would refuse, but how, and in that distinction lay the difference between a futile gesture of individual morality and something that might, if he was clever enough and desperate enough and lucky enough, actually save the people in those buildings and possibly countless others beyond them. As full darkness descended and the first stars appeared in the frozen sky above, Hans Reichmann made a decision that would ripple through the hidden currents of the war in ways he could not yet imagine, but which would begin with a single, terrifying act of deception that required him to become a traitor to his country in order to remain true to himself. He started the engine of his aircraft and taxied not toward his assigned hangar but toward the eastern perimeter of the airfield, where a maintenance shed stood in relative isolation, used primarily for storing obsolete equipment and forgotten supplies. His heart hammered against his ribs as he guided the Messerschmitt through the darkness, knowing that every moment increased the risk of discovery, that a single curious guard or alert officer could end his desperate plan before it even began. But luck or providence held, and he managed to conceal the aircraft behind the shed, covering it with camouflage netting and scattered debris, making it appear abandoned or awaiting repair. Then, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that one misstep would mean his death, he made his way on foot across the frozen ground toward the communications building, a squat concrete structure that housed the airfield's radio equipment and telegraph lines. He had been inside it dozens of times for routine briefings, and he knew its layout, knew which door was often left unlocked by lazy technicians, knew that between midnight and 0200 hours the facility was typically staffed by a single drowsy operator who spent most of his shift reading forbidden novels and listening to confiscated jazz records on a hidden gramophone. Hans waited in the shadows beside the building, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, watching as the silhouette of the lone operator moved past a frosted window. And when the clock inside his mind told him the moment had come, he slipped through the unlocked side door and into the building's interior, where the smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee wrapped around him like a physical presence. The operator, a pale young corporal with thick spectacles and the soft hands of a man who had never fired a weapon in anger, looked up with startled confusion as Hans entered the radio room. And for a frozen instant the two men simply stared at each other, the corporal's hand hovering uncertainly over the alarm button, while Hans calculated the distance between them and the 1,000 different ways this encounter could end in disaster. Then Hans did something that surprised even himself. He told the truth, or at least a version of it naked enough to carry the weight of authenticity. He said that he had received an order to bomb a civilian facility, that he could not carry out the order, that he needed to send a message that would prevent the mission from being reassigned to another pilot, and that if the corporal chose to turn him in he would go quietly, but that the young man would have to live forever with the knowledge that he had enabled the murder of 4,000 innocent people. He spoke quietly, without theatrics or appeals to ideology. simply laying out the moral mathematics of the situation and then waiting, his hands at his sides, his face exhausted and honest. The corporal's eyes, magnified behind his thick lenses, flickered with a complex calculus of fear and conscience and desperate uncertainty. And then, after what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, the young man did something that Hans would remember for the rest of his life. He stepped aside from the radio console and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he needed to visit the latrine and that he would be gone for exactly 10 minutes and that whatever happened during those 10 minutes was not something he had witnessed or could later testify about. Hans moved to the radio equipment with hands that had suddenly become steady, the trembling replaced by a cold, focused clarity that comes to men in moments of absolute commitment. He had thought carefully about what he would transmit, understanding that a direct warning about the camp would be dismissed as enemy propaganda or partisan interference, but that a technical alert about aircraft readiness might be taken seriously if phrased in the proper military language and sent through the correct channels. He composed a message reporting critical engine failures in multiple aircraft of his squadron, recommending an immediate stand-down of all bombing operations pending mechanical inspection, and routing the transmission through what appeared to be a standard maintenance protocol update. Then, before he could second-guess the impulse, he sent a second message, this one encrypted using a frequency he had heard whispered about in the pilot's mess hall, a frequency that was rumored to be monitored by elements within the Wehrmacht who had grown disillusioned with the SS successes and were quietly working to subvert the regime's most extreme orders. This second message was more direct, containing the coordinates of the camp, the details of the planned attack, and a simple plea, for 1,000 lives. Someone must intervene. He had no way of knowing if anyone was truly listening on that frequency, no certainty that his message would reach anyone with the power or courage to act, but he sent it nonetheless because in that moment doing something, anything, was better than the paralysis of despair. When he was finished, he carefully reset the equipment to erase evidence of the transmissions, and he slipped out of the communications building just as the corporal was returning from his extended visit to the latrine, and the two men exchanged a single brief glance of shared complicity before Hans disappeared into the darkness, leaving the young corporal to face whatever consequences might come from his 10 minutes of willful blindness. But Hans Reichmann's night of deception had only just begun, because he understood that sending messages was not enough, that the mission could still proceed if his commanding officer grew suspicious or if the maintenance report was dismissed as overly cautious. He needed to create a situation that would make the mission operationally impossible, at least for the crucial hours during which his radio messages might reach someone who could act on them. And so he made his way to the fuel depot at the northern edge of the airfield, a collection of storage tanks and pumping equipment surrounded by a chain-link fence and guarded, in theory, by a rotating watch of sentries who were in practice far more interested in staying warm than in maintaining alert vigilance. Hans had flown enough missions to know the rhythms of the airfield, to understand when guards changed shifts and where they gathered to smoke cigarettes and share flasks of schnapps acquired through black market channels. He waited until the sentries had retreated to their warming shed for their 0-100 break, and then he moved swiftly to the fuel line that supplied his squadron section of the airfield, locating the valve assembly that controlled flow to the pumps. He did not sabotage it in any obvious way, did not blow it up or cut through critical pipes, because such overt destruction would have been immediately identified as sabotage and would have led to investigations, interrogations, and almost certain discovery of his role. Instead, he carefully adjusted the valve's calibration in a way that would restrict fuel flow to a level insufficient for proper aircraft operation, creating what would appear to be a mechanical malfunction rather than deliberate interference, a problem that might take hours or even days to properly diagnose and repair. It was a small act of technical sabotage, almost invisible in its execution, but its consequences would ground his squadron for at least the critical 24 hours he needed, buying time for his radio messages to find their audience and for whatever intervention might be possible to materialize. As he worked in the darkness, his gloved fingers numb from the cold and slippery with fuel residue, Hans found himself thinking about his father, a Lutheran pastor who had preached quietly against the regime's racial laws and who had been arrested in 1941 for refusing to remove a Jewish family from his church's charity rolls. His father had died in custody, the official report claiming a heart attack, but the body, when it was finally returned to the family, bearing marks that suggested a very different cause of death. Hans had been flying over France when he received the news, and he had completed his mission that day with mechanical precision, dropping his bombs on the designated target and returning to base, because compartmentalization was how you survived the war, how you kept functioning when the world was trying to tear you apart from the inside. But his father's voice had never truly left him. Those Sunday sermons about moral courage and the necessity of standing against evil even when the cost was everything, and now, crouched beside a fuel valve in the frozen darkness of occupied Poland, Hans felt his father's presence as a palpable force, as if the old man's spirit had been waiting for this moment, for the instant when his son would finally choose conscience over comfort, righteousness over survival. Hans allowed himself a brief moment of grief and connection, and then he finished his work on the fuel line and retreated from the depot before the sentries returned, making his way through the shadows back toward the barracks, where he would need to sleep for a few hours and then wake to face whatever consequences his actions had set in motion. Morning came with the pale reluctance of a winter dawn that seemed to sense the day's significance and wished to delay its arrival. Hans was in the pilot's ready room at 0530, drinking bitter ersatz coffee and maintaining the appearance of a man preparing for a routine mission, when the base commander strode in with a face like thunder and announced that all bombing operations were suspended due to critical fuel delivery problems and suspected mechanical issues across multiple aircraft. The commander railed against incompetent maintenance crews and the deteriorating quality of Reich logistics, and he promised severe punishment for whoever was responsible for the equipment failures that had disrupted his carefully planned operation schedule. Hans sat quietly, his face revealing nothing, while around him other pilots groaned in frustration or relief, depending on their individual relationships with combat and mortality. The order to bomb the camp had been postponed, at least for now, but Hans knew that postponement was not cancellation, that he had bought time but not victory, and that his desperate gambit would be meaningless unless his radio messages had reached someone capable of acting on them. The hours that followed were a study in psychological torture, as Hans moved through his duties with mechanical precision while every nerve in his body screamed with tension, wondering if military police would suddenly appear to arrest him, wondering if the fuel sabotage would be discovered, wondering if the mysterious frequency he had transmitted to even existed or if he had sent his plea into empty static, a message that would never be received by anyone who cared. But then, at 1,400 hours, something extraordinary happened that suggested his messages had indeed found their audience. A convoy of Wehrmacht trucks arrived at the airfield without prior announcement, and from them emerged not SS officers but regular army personnel, led by a grim-faced colonel who carried orders transferring jurisdiction over several local facilities, including the camp Hans had been ordered to bomb, from SS administration to Wehrmacht control pending an investigation into administrative irregularities. The SS officers on the base were visibly furious but impotent in the face of the Wehrmacht's superior authority and the paperwork that appeared to be meticulously in order, bearing stamps and signatures from sufficiently high levels of the military bureaucracy to be unassailable. Hans watched this confrontation unfold from a distance, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing, understanding that someone within the Wehrmacht's hierarchy had received his message and had acted with remarkable speed and cunning to create a bureaucratic pretext for seizing control of the camp before the bombing could be rescheduled. It was a dangerous game being played at levels far above his rank, a covert struggle between elements of the military who still clung to traditional concepts of military honor and the SS fanatics who recognized no law except ideology and power. And somehow, impossibly, Hans's desperate radio message had connected with that hidden resistance, had provided the specific information needed to mount an intervention at precisely the right moment. The camp evacuation began that same afternoon, with Wehrmacht soldiers overseeing the transfer of prisoners to a military labor facility where conditions, while still harsh, were not equivalent to the death sentence they had been facing. Hans learned these details in fragments, from overheard conversations and oblique references in briefing documents, never daring to ask direct questions that might reveal his involvement. He understood that the 4,000 people being moved from the camp had no idea how close they had come to death, no knowledge of the bombs that had been loaded and targeted and then miraculously unloaded. They would never know his name, would never understand that a German pilot they would have every reason to hate had chosen to risk everything to save them. And perhaps that anonymity was appropriate, Hans thought, because what he had done was not heroism in any conventional sense but simply the bare minimum required to remain human in a world that was systematically destroying humanity. He had not saved those people out of ideology or strategic calculation but because the alternative was to participate in murder on such a scale that his soul would have been irretrievable, and in choosing to save them he had really been choosing to save himself, or at least the parts of himself that still remembered how to feel shame and compassion. But the ripples of Hans Reichmann's refusal extended far beyond the immediate salvation of those 4,000 prisoners, because the Wehrmacht's intervention at the camp had created a bureaucratic precedent and had exposed fissures in the Reich's apparatus that could be exploited. The colonel who had led the takeover operation, a career officer named Wilhelm Brandt who had been quietly documenting SS atrocities for future evidence, found in Hans's radio message not just specific information about one planned attack but confirmation that there were individuals within the Luftwaffe who were willing to resist the regime's most extreme orders. Over the following weeks, Colonel Brandt made quiet, careful contact with Hans through a series of intermediaries and coded messages, and what began as a single act of individual conscience evolved into something larger. A clandestine network of military personnel who provided intelligence about SS operations to Wehrmacht officers working to subvert or delay the regime's genocidal programs. Hans became a crucial node in this network, using his position as a pilot to observe and report on SS activities at various locations across occupied Poland, always operating with the knowledge that discovery would mean immediate execution but unable to retreat now that he had glimpsed the possibility of meaningful resistance. The network saved other camps from being bombed or liquidated, diverted trainloads of prisoners to labor facilities instead of death camps, and created bureaucratic obstacles that delayed genocide even when they could not completely prevent it. Each life saved was a small victory in a war that seemed determined to devour every moral value humanity had ever claimed to cherish. Yet Hans's actions carried a terrible weight of irony that he was too honest with himself to ignore. He was still a pilot in the Luftwaffe, still flew missions that dropped bombs on military and quasi-military targets, still participated in a war machine that was responsible for death on a continental scale. His refusal of one particularly horrific order did not cleanse him of complicity in everything else, did not transform him into some kind of pure hero figure whose conscience was immaculate. He lived in the gray zones of moral compromise, doing what he could to resist the worst excesses while remaining enmeshed in a system fundamentally dedicated to conquest and oppression. He flew missions over Soviet positions, over Allied supply lines, over targets that sometimes turned out to include civilian infrastructure despite the briefings that claimed otherwise. And each time he returned from these missions, he felt the weight of the contradiction crushing him, the knowledge that his selective morality was still morality built on a foundation of participation in evil. But he continued because to stop entirely would be to abandon the intelligence-gathering role that allowed him to warn Colonel Brandt's network about impending SS operations, and because in the calculus of war there were no choices that did not involve blood, only choices about which blood you would try to prevent and which you would be forced to spill. This grinding tension between resistance and complicity, between the good he could do and the evil he could not avoid, aged him in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar, carving lines into his face and stealing his sleep and leaving him with the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who had looked into the abyss and found himself reflected there. The winter of 1943 gave way to the spring of 1944, and the war's momentum began to shift in ways that even the most ardent believer in the Reich's propaganda could no longer deny. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Allies had established themselves in Italy, and whispers of an impending invasion in the west circulated through the officers' mess with increasing frequency and decreasing denial. Hans continued his double existence, flying missions by day and passing intelligence to the resistance network by night, living always on the knife edge of discovery, sustained by the knowledge that the information he provided had saved not just the original 4,000 prisoners but hundreds or perhaps thousands more whose fates had been altered by bureaucratic interventions and delayed orders. He never met most of his fellow conspirators, communicating through dead drops and intermediaries, maintaining operational security that made the network difficult to penetrate even as it made personal connection impossible. It was lonely work, this business of secret resistance, lonely in a way that was different from the loneliness of combat, because at least in combat you could share your fear with your comrades, but in conspiracy you carried everything in isolation, unable to speak honestly even to the men who slept in the bunks beside you. Then, in June 1944, came the Allied invasion of Normandy, and the Wehrmacht's already strained resources were stretched to breaking across multiple fronts. Hans's squadron was transferred west to support defensive operations against the Allied advance, and for several chaotic weeks he found himself flying missions over France, strafing positions and dropping bombs on bridges and supply columns, engaged in the kind of conventional military operations that felt almost clean compared to the moral sewage of the SS extermination programs. But even here, transferred away from Poland and the network he had helped build, Hans found opportunities to exercise the selective morality that had become his defining characteristic. He developed a reputation for mechanical troubles that forced him to abort missions before reaching target areas, for navigation errors that resulted in bombs being dropped on empty fields rather than on the Allied positions they were meant to hit, for radio malfunctions that prevented him from receiving attack confirmation orders in time to execute them properly. His squadron commander grew increasingly suspicious, but the chaos of the Allied advance created enough confusion that outright accusations were difficult to substantiate, and Hans's previous record of competence and his connections with certain Wehrmacht officers provided him with a thin shield of protection. He was walking a tightrope made of lies and half-truths, and he knew that eventually he would fall, but until that moment came he would continue doing whatever small acts of resistance he could manage, because to do otherwise would be to surrender to the nihilism that was consuming the Reich from within. The summer of 1944 brought the failed assassination attempt against Hitler, and in its aftermath the SS paranoia intensified to levels that made previous security measures seem relaxed by comparison. Officers were arrested on the basis of rumor and association. Interrogations became more brutal and less concerned with actual evidence, and the network of resistance that Hans had been part of began to unravel as informants and torture extracted names and connections. Colonel Brandt was arrested in August, and although he died under interrogation without revealing the full extent of the network, enough information emerged to place several of its members under suspicion. Hans knew that his time was running out, that the circle of investigation was contracting around him, and he began to plan his escape with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his sabotage operations. He established contact with members of the French resistance through a complicated series of intermediaries, negotiating a defection plan that would involve faking his death in a way that would be convincing enough to prevent his family from suffering retaliation. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation had become the defining context of his existence, and in late September 1944, during a mission over Allied-held territory in France, Hans Reichmann made the final break with his country and his former life. He allowed his aircraft to be hit by anti-aircraft fire, not seriously enough to actually bring him down but sufficiently to provide cover for what happened next. He radioed a mayday call, describing catastrophic damage and reporting his intention to attempt a crash landing. And then he guided the aircraft to a predetermined location where resistance fighters were waiting. He set the plane down in a field that had been cleared for precisely this purpose, and before the wreckage could be properly examined by German forces, he was already being hustled away by French partisans who would hide him and eventually smuggle him to Allied lines. The Luftwaffe recorded his death in action, a minor footnote in the vast catalogue of casualties that the war produced by the thousands every day, and his family received notification that he had died honorably in service to the Reich. His mother would grieve for a son she believed dead. His sister would place flowers on a cenotaph that marked an absence, and Hans would carry the guilt of that deception along with all the other guilts that weighted his conscience like stones. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was free to tell his story to Allied intelligence officers who were very interested in learning about the internal resistance within the Wehrmacht and the operations he had participated in to save prisoners from SS atrocities. The remainder of the war Hans spent in Allied custody, not as a prisoner exactly but as an intelligence asset and eventual witness, providing detailed testimony about Wehrmacht operations and the network of officers who had worked to subvert the regime's genocidal programs from within. His information contributed to the broader Allied understanding of the Nazi apparatus and would later be used in war crimes tribunals to establish patterns of knowledge and complicity within the German military hierarchy. But Hans was never entirely comfortable in his new role as an informant against his former country, because however much he despised the regime he had served, he still felt a complex web of loyalty and identity tied to Germany itself, to its culture and language and the decent people who had been swept up in the regime's madness through some combination of ideology, coercion, and moral failure. He occupied an uncomfortable space between condemnation and understanding, between the Allied officers who wanted him to paint all Germans as complicit monsters and his own knowledge that the reality was more complicated, that within the machinery of evil there had been individuals trying desperately to gum up the works, to save what lives they could even as the larger system continued its grinding work of destruction. When the war ended in May 1945 and the full extent of the Holocaust became undeniably public through the liberation of the camps and the documentation of the evidence, Hans experienced a complex mixture of vindication and devastation. Vindication because his early recognition of the regime's evil had been proven correct, devastation because the scale of that evil exceeded even his worst imaginings, and because he understood that his small acts of resistance, however morally necessary, had been utterly insufficient in the face of murder on such an industrial scale. He had saved thousands, perhaps, through his refusal and the network it had helped create, but millions had died, and no mathematics of moral accounting could balance that equation. He struggled with survivor's guilt and the question of whether he should have done more, whether he should have defected earlier or acted more boldly or found ways to resist more extensively, torturing himself with counterfactuals that had no answers. His testimony at several war crimes trials brought him into contact with survivors of the camps, including some from the facility he had saved from bombing, and their gratitude was both deeply moving and almost unbearable, because he felt himself unworthy of thanks for having done only what basic human decency demanded, for having refused to commit one specific atrocity while remaining part of a military apparatus that had committed countless others. In the decades after the war, Hans Reichmann lived quietly in Argentina, where many Germans had fled but where he existed in a very different category from the Nazi war criminals who sought refuge there. He had changed his name, established a new identity, and worked as a translator and teacher, speaking rarely about his wartime experiences and then only with the most careful discretion. He maintained contact with several survivors from the camp he had saved, a correspondence that was equal parts healing and painful, a constant reminder of both what had been preserved and what had been lost. He never married, never had children, carrying his wartime experiences as a weight that made the ordinary intimacies of domestic life feel both impossibly distant and somehow frivolous given the magnitude of what he had witnessed. He read voraciously about the war, about the Holocaust, about moral philosophy and the psychology of obedience, trying to understand how an entire society had been led into such darkness and what his own resistance and complicity said about the nature of individual moral agency within totalitarian systems. His apartment was filled with books and papers, the dwelling of a man engaged in a decades-long dialogue with history and conscience, seeking answers to questions that probably had no satisfying answers. He died in 1987, an old man whose obituary in the local German-language newspaper made no mention of his wartime service or the specific act of refusal that had defined his life. The handful of people who attended his funeral included several children and grandchildren of the prisoners he had saved, people who had been born only because their parents had survived that winter of 1943, their existence itself a living testimony to the consequences of one man's refusal to follow orders. These descendants stood at his grave knowing that they owed their lives to a decision made in darkness and fear by a man who had never claimed to be a hero, who had in fact spent his final decades insisting that he had done only the minimum required to remain human. They placed flowers and spoke words of thanks that Hans could no longer hear, and then they dispersed back to their own lives, carrying with them the story of a German pilot who had said no when every pressure of authority and ideology and military discipline demanded that he say yes. The historical record of Hans Reichmann's refusal remained fragmentary and contested for many years after the war, because the clandestine nature of the resistance network he had been part of meant that documentation was sparse, and because both German and Allied archives were reluctant to complicate the dominant narratives of the war with stories of Wehrmacht members who had actively resisted the regime's worst atrocities. It was only in the 1990s, as Cold War restrictions on document access began to loosen and as historians started conducting more nuanced research into German military resistance, that the full scope of Hans's actions and the network he had helped sustain began to emerge from the archival shadows. Researchers found the radio transcripts, the maintenance reports, the bureaucratic correspondence that had been used to transfer jurisdiction over the camp, and slowly they pieced together the story of how one pilot's refusal had catalyzed a larger chain of interventions that had saved thousands of lives. The story was still imperfect, still full of gaps and uncertainties, but it was enough to establish that within the Wehrmacht there had been individuals who had recognized the moral catastrophe of the regime's policies and had risked everything to resist them in whatever limited ways their positions allowed. This historical revelation came too late for Hans himself to witness, but it served an important function in the broader process of German historical reckoning with the Nazi period. For decades, the dominant narrative had portrayed the Wehrmacht as either fully complicit in Nazi crimes or as professional soldiers who had been simply following orders in a conventional military conflict, with little acknowledgement of the complex reality that included both extensive collaboration with genocide and limited resistance from individuals who had retained moral clarity. The discovery of Hans Reichmann's story and others like it did not excuse the Wehrmacht's massive participation in war crimes and genocide, But it did provide evidence that even within totalitarian systems, individual moral agency was possible, that there had been Germans who had said no, and that their courage, however limited in its overall impact, represented a thread of human decency that had survived even in the darkest circumstances. For survivors and their descendants, these stories offered a more complex understanding of the perpetrator society, a recognition that while the vast majority had participated or acquiesced, there had been exceptions whose actions deserved to be remembered and honored. The deeper significance of Hans Reichmann's refusal lies not in any claim that he was representative of Germans during the Nazi period, because clearly he was exceptional rather than typical, but in what his story reveals about the nature of moral choice under conditions of extreme pressure and institutional evil. He was not a saint or a natural rebel, but an ordinary person who had been raised in the values of duty and obedience, and who had served his country's military with competence and dedication until the moment when those values collided catastrophically with the fundamental requirements of human conscience. His decision to refuse the bombing order was not instantaneous or easy, but the result of a long process of moral erosion and accumulated horror that had finally reached a breaking point. And crucially, his refusal was not a simple act of saying no, but a complex operation of sabotage, communication, and risk that required intelligence, courage, and a willingness to operate in the gray zones of deception and partial complicity. His story suggests that moral resistance within totalitarian systems is rarely clean or heroic in the Hollywood sense, but messy, compromised, and fraught with impossible choices, and that the people who engage in such resistance are often motivated less by ideology than by a desperate need to preserve some core of their humanity against systems designed to destroy it. In the final analysis, what Hans Reichmann accomplished with his refusal was not to redeem the German military or to significantly alter the overall trajectory of the Holocaust, but to prove that even in the most extreme circumstances, individual moral agency was possible, that there were points at which a person could choose to say no even when every external pressure demanded compliance, and that such choices, while costly and insufficient, were nevertheless profoundly meaningful. He saved 4,000 lives that winter night in 1943 when he refused to drop his bombs, and he contributed to saving thousands more through the resistance network his action helped catalyze. And while those numbers are horrifyingly small against the 6 million murdered in the Holocaust, they represent 6,000 individual human beings with names and faces and families, 6,000 futures that existed because one man chose conscience over obedience. Each of those people went on to live lives that produced children and grandchildren, creating a ripple effect that means tens of thousands of people alive today exist because of a decision made in a freezing cockpit 80 years ago. That is the mathematics of moral courage. Not that it solved the problem or defeated the evil, but that it preserved specific, irreplaceable human lives and proved that even in hell, there remained people who refused to become demons. And so the story of Hans Reichmann stands as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that systems of oppression depend ultimately on the willingness of individuals to carry out their orders, and that the refusal of even a small number of those individuals can disrupt the machinery of evil in ways that save lives and preserve human dignity. But it is also a warning about how rare such refusals are, how enormous the pressures toward compliance become in totalitarian contexts, and how the vast majority of people, decent people who think of themselves as moral, will nonetheless participate in or acquiesce to atrocity when the costs of resistance seem too high. Hans Reichmann was not exceptional because he was born with unusual courage or moral clarity, but because at the crucial moment he managed to overcome the very ordinary human tendencies toward obedience, rationalization, and self-preservation that allow evil to flourish. His story asks uncomfortable questions about what we would do in similar circumstances, whether we would have the strength to say no when doing so meant sacrificing everything, and whether we recognize the smaller moments in our own lives when we are called to choose between comfort and conscience, between going along and standing apart. In a world that continues to generate its own atrocities and moral emergencies, the legacy of Hans Reichmann's refusal remains urgently relevant, a testimony to the terrible but necessary truth that in the end, each of us bears individual responsibility for the orders we follow and the orders we refuse, and that the claim of having no choice is almost always a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the costs of doing what we know to be right. The winter sky over Poland that night in 1943 was the color of iron and ash, and in a cockpit somewhere beneath it, a man held an envelope containing orders to commit mass murder, and he said no, and thousands lived because of it, and decades later when he died in exile, he was buried with the quiet knowledge that he had at least preserved one part of himself intact through the war's moral inferno. The part that remembered, even when the whole world seemed to have forgotten, that every human life is irreplaceable and infinitely precious, and that no order from any authority can make murder into duty or obedience into honor, and that the only freedom that finally matters is the freedom to refuse to become what the darkness demands we must be.